My name is Alice. I'm 53 years old and I thought I knew everything about my children. I had raised two beautiful kids, watched them grow into successful adults, and felt like the proudest mother in America. My son David had just graduated medical school. At 24, my daughter Sarah was thriving in college at 22, and that Thanksgiving morning felt like pure magic. As I pulled my famous stuffing from the oven, the same recipe my grandmother taught me 40 years ago, I had no idea that in just a few hours, one whispered confession would shatter everything I believed about my family. Before we dive into what happened that day, I would love to know where you are watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more real life stories. Trust me, you will want to stay until the end. Because what my son told me in that hospital bed will change how you look at the people you love most. The morning sun streamed through my kitchen windows as I tied my apron around my waist, humming softly while I prepared what I considered the most important meal of the year. Thanksgiving had always been sacred in our household. For 25 years, I had been perfecting this feast, and every dish held memories that stretched back generations. The turkey was already golden brown in the oven, filling the entire house with that unmistakable aroma that meant family and gratitude. Tom wandered into the kitchen in his favorite flannel shirt, stealing a piece of cornbread from the cooling rack, like he had done every Thanksgiving morning since we got married. At 56, my husband still had that boyish grin that made me fall in love with him in college. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Smells incredible in here, honey," he murmured, watching me carefully layer the herbs in my stuffing mixture. "The kids are going to lose their minds when they taste this." David had driven in from Boston the night before, exhausted from his final rotations at Massachusetts General Hospital. Seeing him walk through our front door in his scrubs, stethoscope still hanging around his neck, had filled me with such overwhelming pride. My baby boy was going to be a doctor. All those years of worry, of helping him through medical school stress, of watching him push himself harder than any young person should have to, had finally paid off. Sarah arrived that morning, her bright smile lighting up the entire house as she burst through the door with her arms full of flowers she had picked up from the farmer's market. At 22, she was studying education and planned to become an elementary school teacher. Where David was intense and driven, Sarah was pure sunshine, always ready with a hug or a joke to lighten any mood. "Mom, let me help with something," David insisted, rolling up his sleeves as he surveyed the organized chaos of our holiday kitchen. His dark hair was a little longer than usual, and I noticed he looked thinner than when I had seen him at graduation 3 months earlier. Medical residency was demanding, I told myself. All young doctors went through this phase. "You just focus on relaxing, sweetheart," I replied, shooing him away from the stove. "You work hard enough at the hospital. Today is about family time." But David was persistent the way he had been since childhood. When he set his mind to something, he started chopping vegetables for the salad, and I watched him work with those precise, steady hands that would soon be saving lives. Sarah set our dining room table with the good china, the same set my mother had used when I was growing up. She folded the napkins into perfect little swans, a trick she had learned in her hospitality management class. The house filled with the sounds of football from the living room, where Tom had settled in to watch the game, the gentle bubbling of pots on the stove, and our easy conversation about Sarah's classes and David's upcoming residency placement. This was exactly how Thanksgiving was supposed to feel: warm and full of love, with 3 generations of recipes coming together on one perfect table. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself stealing glances at my children, marveling at who they had become. David was explaining some complex medical procedure to Sarah, who listened with genuine fascination, asking intelligent questions that made him light up with enthusiasm. They had always been close, despite their 4-year age difference, and watching them together as adults filled my heart with pure contentment. The stuffing was my grandmother's secret recipe, something she had passed down to my mother, who had taught it to me when I got married. It required a special blend of herbs that had to be mixed in exact proportions bread, that had to be dried for precisely the right amount of time, and a cooking technique that took years to master. I had been making this dish for our family for over 2 decades, and it had never failed to bring smiles and requests for seconds. Mom, this kitchen smells exactly like heaven, Sarah declared, wrapping her arms around me in one of her signature bear hugs. I cannot wait to learn all your recipes when I have my own family someday. Everything was absolutely perfect. The turkey was golden and juicy, the cranberry sauce had set beautifully, and my famous stuffing was aromatic perfection. As we gathered around the table, I looked at Tom carving the turkey with practiced skill, Sarah giggling at something David had whispered to her, and David himself looking more relaxed than I had seen him in months. This was what I had worked for my entire adult life, these moments of pure family harmony. We gathered around our dining room table as the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the windows, illuminating the feast I had spent all day preparing. The table looked like something from a magazine spread, with my grandmother's china gleaming under the crystal chandelier, fresh flowers Sarah had arranged as a centerpiece, and enough food to feed a small army. Tom sat at the head of the table, David and Sarah on either side, and I took my usual spot where I could easily jump up to grab anything we might need from the kitchen. Before we dig in, let's take a moment to share what we are grateful for this year. I suggested a tradition we had maintained since the children were small. Tom reached for my hand on one side and Sarah grabbed his on the other, completing our family circle. I'm grateful for this incredible woman who somehow manages to make every holiday feel magical, Tom said, squeezing my fingers gently. And for 2 kids who make me proud every single day. Sarah went next, her voice warm with emotion. I'm thankful for parents who supported every crazy dream I ever had, and for David, who always believed I could do anything even when I did not believe in myself. David's turn came, and he hesitated for just a moment, his dark eyes seeming to take in each of our faces with unusual intensity. I'm grateful for this family for always being my safe harbor, no matter how crazy life gets. And for Mom's cooking, which is definitely the best medicine any doctor could prescribe. We laughed at his joke, and I felt that familiar warmth spreading through my chest. The kind of contentment that only comes from having your whole family together and happy. I said my own prayer of gratitude for these 3 beautiful people who made my life complete, and then Tom ceremoniously picked up the carving knife to begin serving our feast. The passing of dishes around our table was like a perfectly choreographed dance we had performed hundreds of times before. Tom carved generous portions of turkey for everyone. Sarah ladled her favorite sweet potato casserole onto each plate, and I proudly served my special stuffing, the star of our Thanksgiving menu. David reached for the cranberry sauce, his favorite since childhood, and I smiled, watching him heap a generous portion beside his turkey. Mom, this stuffing smells even more amazing than usual, David commented, taking the serving spoon and placing a large portion on his plate. Did you change something about the recipe? Not a thing, sweetheart. Same recipe Grandma Rose taught me when you were just a baby, I replied, watching with satisfaction as steam rose from the herb-scented mixture. I think I just put extra love into it this year because I'm so happy to have everyone home. David lifted his fork, loaded with stuffing turkey and a touch of cranberry sauce, the perfect Thanksgiving bite. He smiled at me across the table, that same sweet expression he had worn as a little boy when he was about to taste something delicious. Here's to family traditions, he said, and took his first bite. For about 10 seconds, everything remained perfectly normal. David chewed thoughtfully. Sarah was telling us about her education classes, and Tom was reaching for the gravy boat. Then I noticed David's expression change. His eyes widened slightly, and he reached for his water glass, taking a long drink. I assumed the stuffing was just hot and thought nothing of it. But then David started coughing, not the gentle clearing of throat that comes from eating too quickly, but deep, violent coughs that made him grab his chest. His face began to flush red, and then a terrifying blue tinge appeared around his lips. Sarah stopped talking mid-sentence, and Tom dropped his fork with a clatter. "David," I called, starting to rise from my chair. "Are you okay, honey?" He tried to speak, but only a strange choking sound came out. His hands flew to his throat, and his eyes filled with panic. Then, in what felt like slow motion, David's body went rigid for a moment before he collapsed sideways in his chair, his head hitting the edge of the table as he fell. "David!" Sarah screamed, jumping up so quickly that her chair toppled backward. Tom was already moving, catching our son as he slumped toward the floor, his body convulsing in ways that made my stomach turn to ice. "Call 911!" Tom shouted, laying David on the dining room floor and checking for a pulse. "Alice, call 911 right now." My hands shook so violently I could barely dial, but somehow I managed to get through to emergency services while Tom performed CPR on our son's limp body. David's face had gone completely blue, and foam was coming from his mouth. Sarah was crying hysterically, and I felt like I was trapped in the worst nightmare imaginable. The paramedics arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. They immediately took over David's care, asking rapid-fire questions about what he had eaten, what medications he was taking, whether he had any known allergies. I answered as best I could through my panic, but nothing made sense. David had eaten our family Thanksgiving dinner hundreds of times before without any problems. They loaded him into the ambulance and Tom rode with them, while Sarah and I followed in our car. The 20-minute drive to the hospital passed in a blur of tears, prayers, and desperate phone calls to family members. All I could think about was David's blue lips and the way his body had convulsed on our dining room floor right next to the table that was still set with our perfect Thanksgiving feast. The emergency room at Mercy General Hospital became our world for the next 8 hours. Tom paced the waiting room like a caged animal, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it, while Sarah sat curled up in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs, her face streaked with tears that seemed to never stop flowing. I found myself standing by the windows, staring out at the parking lot without really seeing anything, my mind replaying those horrible moments when David collapsed over and over again. Dr. Martinez, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, emerged from the treatment area every hour or so to give us updates that only seemed to raise more questions. David's vital signs had stabilized, but he remained unconscious. They were running extensive blood tests, checking for everything from allergic reactions to food poisoning to more serious conditions I did not want to think about. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you some detailed questions about the meal preparation." "Doctor," Martinez said, gently pulling up a chair to sit across from me. "We're seeing some unusual indicators in David's blood work that suggest possible poisoning, but we need to determine the source." The word poisoning hit me like a physical blow. "That's impossible," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I've been making that exact same meal for 25 years. I used all fresh ingredients, followed every food safety protocol I know. There's no way I could have poisoned my own son." But even as I said the words, doubt began creeping into my mind like poison itself. Had I missed something? Had one of the ingredients gone bad without my noticing? Had I somehow contaminated the food during preparation? The thought that I might be responsible for David's condition made me feel physically sick. Tom sat down beside me and took my hand, his own shaking just as badly as mine. "Alice, this is not your fault," he said firmly, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice too. "You're the most careful cook I know. There has to be another explanation." The questions from medical staff and police officers seemed endless. What time had I started cooking? Where had I purchased the ingredients? Had anyone else helped with meal preparation? Had David seemed ill earlier in the day? I answered everything as thoroughly as I could, but the weight of their suspicion was crushing. In their eyes, I could see the assumption that the mother had somehow failed to protect her child. Sarah held my other hand, her young face pale with shock and exhaustion. Mom, David is going to be okay. She kept saying as much to convince herself as to comfort me. He's strong and he's in good hands here. The doctors will figure out what happened. Hours passed with no significant changes. David remained unconscious, hooked up to machines that monitored every aspect of his vital functions. The hospital staff allowed us to take turns, sitting with him for short periods, and each time I looked at my son, lying so still in that hospital bed, my heart broke a little more. His face was pale but peaceful, and if not for all the medical equipment, he might have just been sleeping. I found myself thinking about all the Thanksgivings we had shared, all the times David had praised my cooking and asked for seconds of that same stuffing recipe. How could something that had brought our family so much joy suddenly become the thing that nearly killed him? The irony was almost too cruel to bear. Around midnight, Dr. Martinez returned with more test results, her expression serious but slightly puzzled. We've confirmed that David was definitely poisoned, but the toxicology reports are showing something unexpected, she explained. The substance in his system is not something that would typically be found in food preparation. It's more consistent with intentional ingestion of a specific type of plant, alkaloid. Tom and I stared at her, not understanding the implications of what she was saying. What does that mean exactly? Tom asked, his voice hoarse from hours of worry. It means this was not accidental food poisoning from spoiled ingredients or improper cooking, Dr. Martinez replied carefully. Someone would have had to deliberately add this substance to food or drink. The concentration in David's system suggests it was a significant amount, enough to cause the severe reaction we witnessed. The room began spinning around me as the full meaning of her words sank in. Someone had deliberately poisoned my son. But who and how? The only people who had access to our Thanksgiving meal were family members. The possibility that someone in our own home had tried to hurt David was too horrible to even consider. Police Detective Johnson arrived shortly after Dr. G. Martinez's revelation, a middle-aged man with kind eyes who spoke to us with gentle authority. He explained that they would need to treat our home as a potential crime scene, collecting samples of all the food and investigating every aspect of meal preparation. The thought of strangers going through my kitchen, treating my sanctuary as the site of an attempted murder, made me feel violated in ways I could not even articulate. As dawn approached, exhaustion was weighing heavily on all of us, but none of us could bear the thought of leaving David alone in that sterile hospital room. Tom had dozed off in the uncomfortable chair beside the bed. Sarah was curled up on a small couch in the corner, and I sat holding David's hand, willing him to open his eyes and tell us this was all just a terrible nightmare. It was 3:15 in the morning when David's eyelids finally fluttered open. I had been dozing in the chair beside his bed, my hand still holding his, when I felt his fingers twitch slightly against mine. Tom was sleeping fitfully in the corner chair, and Sarah had gone down to the cafeteria with my sister, who had driven up from Philadelphia to be with us during this nightmare. David, I whispered, leaning forward as his dark eyes slowly focused on my face. Oh, sweetheart, thank God you're awake. How do you feel? He blinked several times, his gaze moving around the hospital room with confusion, before settling back on me. His lips were dry and cracked, and when he tried to speak, only a hoarse whisper came out. I quickly reached for the cup of water on his bedside table, helping him take small sips through a straw. Mom, he whispered, his voice barely audible, but gaining strength with each word. Where am I? What happened? You're at Mercy General Hospital, baby. You collapsed during Thanksgiving dinner, and we've been so worried about you. I smoothed his hair back from his forehead, relief flooding through me at seeing his eyes alert and responsive. The doctors say you were poisoned, but we don't know how or why yet. David's expression changed immediately, and I saw something flicker across his face that I could not quite identify. Fear, maybe, or recognition. He glanced toward the corner where Tom was sleeping, then back at me, his grip on my hand suddenly becoming urgent. Mom, I need to tell you something, he whispered, his voice taking on an intensity that made my stomach clench with new anxiety. But you have to promise to listen to everything I say before you react. Something in his tone made my blood run cold. David, what is it you're scaring me? He looked around the room again, making sure we were truly alone, then pulled me closer to the bed so he could speak directly into my ear. What he said next changed everything I thought I knew about my son, my family, and that terrible Thanksgiving day. Mom, I poisoned myself. He whispered his words, hitting me like a physical blow. I put something in the stuffing when you weren't looking in the kitchen. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't someone trying to hurt me. I did this to myself on purpose. For a moment, I was sure I had misheard him. The medications, the stress, the exhaustion of the past day had to be affecting my ability to process what he was saying. David, you're confused, honey. The pain medication is making you say things that don't make sense. But he shook his head adamantly, his eyes clearer and more focused than I had seen them since he collapsed. No, Mom, I'm telling you the truth. I've been planning this for months. I researched different substances, different methods, different ways to make it look like an accident, so that you and Dad and Sarah wouldn't have to deal with the shame and guilt that comes with suicide. The word suicide hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I felt like I could not breathe, could not think, could not process what my son was telling me. This was David, my brilliant, successful, beloved son, who had just graduated medical school and had his whole future spread out before him, like a golden path. That's impossible, I whispered back, tears starting to stream down my face. You're going to be a doctor. You just graduated. You have everything to live for. David's eyes filled with tears that matched my own. Mom, I've been drowning for 2 years. The pressure, the expectations, the constant feeling that I'm never good enough, no matter how hard I work or how much I achieve. I wake up every morning feeling like I'm suffocating. And I go to bed every night planning ways to make the pain stop. His confession continued in hushed, urgent whispers that cut through my heart like shards of glass. He told me about the months of research he had done into different methods, his decision to use a plant alkaloid that would cause symptoms similar to food poisoning, his plan to make his death look accidental so that our family would not have to carry the burden of his suicide. I chose Thanksgiving because I wanted all of you together when it happened. He whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. I thought if I died surrounded by family eating Mom's famous stuffing, it would at least be a beautiful last memory. I never wanted you to blame yourself or think you had done anything wrong. As his words sank in, I realized that the son I thought I knew so well had been living in a private hell that I had completely failed to recognize. All those times I had attributed his withdrawal and exhaustion to medical school stress. All those phone calls where he had seemed distant and distracted. All those moments when I should have looked deeper and asked harder questions. The most devastating part of his confession was yet to come. But Mom, when I saw you and Dad and Sarah panicking, when I realized how much pain I was causing all of you, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. In those last few seconds before I lost consciousness, I realized that I don't actually want to die. I just want the pain to stop, and those are two completely different things. Sitting in that sterile hospital room listening to my son's whispered confession, I felt like the ground beneath my entire world had shifted permanently. Everything I thought I knew about David, about our family, about my abilities as a mother, crumbled away in the space of those few devastating minutes. How had I missed the signs that my own child was suffering so deeply? How had I failed so completely to see past his perfect exterior to the pain he was hiding underneath? David's dark eyes searched my face desperately as he continued his confession, his voice gaining strength even as his words grew more heartbreaking. Mom, I've been researching this for 8 months. I know exactly which websites to visit, which books to read, how to make it look like anything except what it really was. I thought I was protecting all of you from the truth. I found myself remembering moments from the past year with new and terrible clarity. The phone call 3 months ago when David had seemed unusually quiet and claimed he was just tired from studying. The way he had lost weight over the summer and laughed off my concerns about his eating habits. The forced cheerfulness in his voice during our weekly check-ins, which I had attributed to the natural stress of medical school, but now recognized as something much darker. "Tell me about the signs I missed," I whispered, needing to understand how I had failed him so completely. "Help me see what I should have noticed." David's confession unfolded like a roadmap of missed opportunities. He told me about the panic attacks he had started having during his surgery rotations, attacks he had hidden by stepping into supply closets and bathroom stalls until they passed. He described the overwhelming feeling of being an imposter, despite his excellent grades and positive evaluations, convinced that everyone would eventually discover he was not smart enough or capable enough to be a real doctor. "Remember when I called you crying after that patient died during my emergency medicine rotation?" he asked, and I nodded, recalling how I had tried to comfort him by explaining that loss was part of medicine. I wasn't just sad about losing that patient, Mom. I was convinced that I had somehow caused his death, that I was dangerous to the people I was supposed to help. The guilt was eating me alive. He talked about the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the way he had started avoiding social situations and isolating himself from classmates and friends. What I had interpreted as dedication to his studies was actually David withdrawing from anything that might trigger his growing depression and self-doubt. The worst part was feeling like I couldn't talk to any of you about it. David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Dad were so proud of me for getting into medical school. Sarah was always bragging to her friends about her doctor brother, and I felt like admitting I was struggling would be letting everyone down. I thought it was better to just disappear quietly than to become a disappointment. I realized with growing horror that our family's love and pride had somehow become part of the prison that trapped David in his suffering. Every time we celebrated his achievements, every time we introduced him as our son the doctor, we had unknowingly added weight to the expectations that were crushing him. David, why didn't you trust us enough to tell us the truth?" I asked, though I was starting to understand the answer even as the words left my mouth. "Because I love all of you too much," he replied simply. "I saw how happy my success made you, how much hope you had invested in my future. I couldn't bear the thought of destroying that happiness by admitting I was falling apart. I thought if I just disappeared, you could remember me as the son who made you proud instead of the son who gave up." His plan had been methodical and heartbreaking in its consideration for our feelings. He had chosen a substance that would cause symptoms resembling food poisoning or an allergic reaction, something that would allow us to blame bad luck or medical mystery rather than his deliberate choice. He had timed it for Thanksgiving, so we would all be together, thinking that shared grief might be easier to bear than individual isolation. "I even wrote letters," he admitted, "explaining everything, telling each of you how much I love you and that none of this was your fault. They're hidden in my apartment with instructions for the landlord to give them to you if anything ever happened to me." The thought of David sitting alone in his apartment, writing goodbye letters to his family while researching ways to end his life broke something inside me that I was not sure could ever be repaired. But alongside the devastating grief, I felt something else beginning to grow, a fierce protective anger that my child had suffered so much alone. "David Michael Henderson," I said, using his full name the way I had when he was little, and had done something that required serious discussion. "You listen to me very carefully. I don't care if you flunk out of medical school tomorrow. I don't care if you decide to become a professional street mime. The only thing I have ever wanted, the only thing that has ever mattered to me is having you alive and healthy and happy." For the first time since his confession began, I saw something like hope flicker in David's eyes. But Mom, I've worked so hard to get here. Everyone is counting on me to succeed. No, baby, I said firmly, taking his face in my hands the way I had when he was a child with skinned knees or hurt feelings. The only thing anyone is counting on is having you here with us. Everything else is just details we can figure out together. The next 6 hours were among the most difficult and transformative of my entire life. After David's confession, I faced an agonizing decision that would affect our entire family's future. He begged me not to tell Tom and Sarah the truth, terrified that they would blame themselves or see him differently. But I knew that keeping this secret would only perpetuate the isolation and shame that had nearly killed my son. When Tom woke up and Sarah returned from the cafeteria, I asked them to sit down because David had something important to tell us all. The conversation that followed was raw and painful, filled with tears, anger, confusion, and ultimately an outpouring of love that I had not known our family was capable of expressing. Tom's initial reaction was shock that quickly turned to fury, not at David, but at himself for missing the signs. How did I not know my own son was planning to kill himself? He demanded, pacing the small hospital room like a man possessed. What kind of father am I, that my kid felt like he couldn't come to me when he was drowning? Sarah's response surprised us all. At 22, she displayed a maturity and emotional intelligence that took my breath away. David, I've been worried about you for months, she said quietly. You stopped laughing at my jokes, stopped calling me just to chat, stopped being yourself. I thought you were just busy, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I should have pushed harder to get you to talk to me. What followed was the most honest conversation our family had ever had. We talked about the pressure we had unknowingly placed on David to be perfect, the way our pride in his achievements had become a burden rather than a gift. We discussed mental health in ways we had never done before, acknowledging our family's tendency to push through difficulties rather than address them directly. But talking was only the beginning. I realized that if I wanted to save David's life, I needed to become his fierce advocate in ways I had never imagined. The hospital's initial response was to recommend a 72-hour psychiatric hold followed by outpatient therapy. But I knew that was nowhere near enough for someone who had been planning suicide for 8 months. I spent the next 3 days researching intensive treatment programs, calling specialists across the country, and fighting with our insurance company to get coverage for the level of care David truly needed. I became a warrior in ways I never knew I could be, refusing to accept good enough when my son's life was at stake. The process was exhausting and often frustrating. Insurance representatives told me that David did not qualify for intensive treatment because his suicide attempt was not serious enough, since he had survived without permanent physical damage. Medical professionals suggested that a few therapy sessions would probably resolve his adjustment issues with medical school stress. But I had learned something crucial from David's confession. Sometimes, the people who look most successful on the outside are struggling the most on the inside. I was not going to let bureaucratic red tape or medical assumptions stand between my son and the help he deserved. I found a residential treatment program in Colorado that specialized in helping high-achieving professionals who struggled with depression and suicidal ideation. The program was expensive and not fully covered by insurance, but Tom and I decided immediately that money meant nothing compared to David's life. "We'll sell the house if we have to," Tom declared when I showed him the program information. "We'll cash out our retirement accounts, take out loans, do whatever it takes. Nothing else matters except getting David the help he needs." The conversation with David about entering residential treatment was difficult but necessary. He was terrified of the stigma, worried about what it would mean for his medical career, concerned about the financial burden on our family. But he was also, for the first time in months, genuinely hopeful that there might be a way forward that did not involve ending his life. "Will you still love me if I never become a doctor?" he asked me one afternoon as we filled out treatment program applications together. David, I will love you if you become a doctor, a teacher, a garbage collector, or decide to spend your life making balloon animals at children's parties. I replied, my love for you has never been conditional on your achievements, and it never will be. 3 weeks after that horrible Thanksgiving Day, I drove David to Colorado myself, determined to see him safely settled into the program that would help him rebuild his life. The drive took 2 days, and we spent those hours in the car having conversations we should have been having for years. He told me more about his struggles, and I told him about my own battles with anxiety and perfectionism that I had never shared with him before. I wish I had known that you understood what it felt like to struggle, David said as we crossed the Colorado state line. I always thought you and Dad had everything figured out, that you never doubted yourselves or felt overwhelmed by life. I realized then that part of helping David heal would involve being more honest about my own vulnerabilities and challenges. Our family had been so focused on presenting strength and success that we had forgotten to show our children that it was safe to be human. 6 months after David entered the residential treatment program in Colorado, I was sitting in that same hospital room where he had first confessed the truth to me, but this time the circumstances were completely different. David was there for a routine follow-up appointment with Dr. Martinez, who had become not just his physician but an important part of his ongoing care team. The man who walked into that room was recognizably my son, but transformed in ways that went far beyond the obvious changes, like his healthier weight and the genuine smile that had returned to his face. There was a peace about him, a groundedness that I had not seen since he was a child, before the pressures of achievement and expectation had begun weighing him down. Mom, I want to show you something, David said, pulling a small notebook from his jacket pocket. This is my daily gratitude journal. Dr. Peterson suggested I start keeping track of 3 things I appreciate each day, no matter how small they might be. I looked at the pages he showed me, filled with his familiar handwriting, documenting moments of joy, connection, and simple human experiences that he was learning to value again. Yesterday, I was grateful for the way the morning light looked on the mountains outside my window, for laughing until my stomach hurt during group therapy, and for the phone call with Sarah, where she told me about her student teaching placement. The intensive program had taught David skills for managing his depression and anxiety that he wished he had learned years earlier. He was practicing mindfulness meditation, participating in group therapy with other high-achieving individuals who struggled with similar issues, and working with specialized counselors who understood the unique pressures faced by medical students and professionals. The hardest part was learning that I could step back from medical school without it meaning I was a failure. David told me during one of our weekly video calls while he was in treatment. I had to separate my identity as a person from my identity as a future doctor, which was terrifying because I had been the smart kid who was going to be a doctor for so long that I did not know who I was without that label. He had made the difficult decision to take a medical leave of absence from his residency program with full support from his supervisors who appreciated his honesty about his mental health struggles. The program director had told him that self-awareness and the courage to seek help when needed were exactly the qualities that would make him a better physician in the long run. Our family had also been participating in therapy sessions, both individually and together, learning new ways to communicate and support each other that did not involve the perfectionist expectations that had nearly cost us everything. Sarah had surprised us all by revealing her own struggles with anxiety about living up to David's academic achievements, something she had been hiding for years. I never told anyone this, but I used to have panic attacks before exams because I was so afraid of not being as smart as David. She admitted during one of our family sessions, I thought if I was not exceptional like him, I would disappoint you and Dad. Tom and I realized that our parenting style, while well-intentioned, had inadvertently created an environment where both our children felt they needed to be perfect to earn our love and approval. We were learning to celebrate effort and growth rather than just achievements, to ask about feelings and struggles rather than just grades and accomplishments. The most transformative change for me personally was becoming an advocate for mental health awareness in our community. I started speaking at local parent groups, sharing our story, in hopes of helping other families recognize warning signs we had missed. The response was overwhelming, with dozens of parents approaching me afterward to share their own concerns about their children's mental health. I never realized that my straight A student, who never caused any trouble, might be the one I should be most worried about. One mother told me after a presentation at our local high school, "You've helped me understand that sometimes the kids who look most successful are the ones struggling the most." I also started volunteering with a non-profit organization that provided mental health resources for medical students and healthcare professionals. The statistics I learned were staggering. Medical students had rates of depression and suicide significantly higher than their peers in other fields, but the culture of medicine often discouraged seeking help for fear it would damage their careers. That Thanksgiving, exactly 1 year after David's suicide attempt, our family gathered around the same dining room table where everything had changed, but the celebration was different in profound ways that went far beyond the obvious absence of my famous stuffing recipe, which I had retired permanently as too painful to ever prepare again. David was home from Colorado, healthy and preparing to return to medical school in the spring, with new coping strategies and a completely different relationship with stress and perfectionism. Sarah had just gotten engaged to a wonderful young man who loved her exactly as she was, anxiety and all. Tom had started seeing his own therapist to work through the guilt he carried about missing the signs of David's depression. Instead of my traditional stuffing, we had asked each family member to contribute a dish that represented something meaningful about their journey over the past year. David brought a quinoa salad he had learned to make in treatment, joking that it was therapy food, but admitting he actually enjoyed cooking as a form of meditation. Sarah made a dessert that was slightly lopsided and imperfect, celebrating her newfound ability to do things without requiring them to be flawless. "I'm grateful for the worst day of our lives," I said when it came time for our traditional sharing of thanks, "because it taught us how to really see each other, how to love without conditions, and how to ask for help when we need it most." David's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. "I'm thankful for a family that loved me enough to fight for my life even when I could not fight for it myself. And I'm grateful for second chances, for therapy, for morning coffee, and for learning that it's okay to be human." The lesson I learned from that terrible and transformative Thanksgiving was that the people we love most can be suffering in ways we never imagined, hidden behind smiles and achievements, and the desire to protect us from their pain. Real love means looking deeper than surface success, asking harder questions than, "How are your grades?" and creating spaces where vulnerability is not just accepted, but welcomed. I learned that mental health struggles do not discriminate based on intelligence, success, or family background. Depression can affect anyone, including the children who seem to have everything going for them. Most importantly, I learned that healing is possible when we stop hiding behind perfectionist facades and start showing up for each other with radical honesty and unconditional love. As I watched my son laugh with his sister over some silly joke, as I saw the lightness in his eyes that had been missing for so long, I felt profound gratitude for the whispered confession that had initially frozen my heart, but ultimately saved our entire family. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the doorways to the most important transformations we will ever experience. If you're watching this and recognizing signs in someone you love, please don't wait for a crisis to reach out for help. Ask the hard questions, create safe spaces for honest conversation. And remember that sometimes the strongest people need the most support. Have you ever missed warning signs in someone close to you? Or have you struggled with mental health challenges yourself? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that matter. Your engagement helps us reach other families who might need to hear these messages. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. May your own family conversations be filled with the kind of honesty and love that can truly save lives.